Welcome to this session. Welcome to this session of the WorldSkills Premier Experience. And I'm simply, hello, nice to see you. I'm here on behalf of WorldSkills to welcome you and to get you started and introduce our speaker, who will basically kind of introduce himself, I think. And you're ready to go with your presentation? Terrific. And when you're done, you can handle all the questions and I will be thanking you. Off you go. How's that for simple, eh? Terrific.
Simple's easy. Well, g'day. I generally like to start my presentations with the g'day because generally people hear my accent and tend to believe that I come from New Zealand. Not that I've got any disrespect to New Zealanders, but I have got some friends that are New Zealand, but I think it tends to sort of break the ice when I say that. I've got the toughest gig, the last session for the day. I hope you find it interactive. But I want to take you through a bit of a journey so far as our group training system in Australia, how we're moulding it into the UK, and how the challenges and the future opportunities that it also presents. Probably first by introduction about myself and our organisation. You'll notice MEGT that's up there, and just in brief, MEGT has been a long-standing group training company within Australia, and probably the part that I need to, for those that don't understand what group training is, I probably need to give you a little quick kitchen tour about the term group training. Group training, the easiest way to describe it is essentially labour hire for entry-level apprentices. So it's the easiest way, labour hire, but it's also got the vocational education and the apprenticeship framework or program bolted onto it. Essentially, MEGT, as I mentioned, has been around since the 80s. We're currently operating 72 locations in Australia with the best of 1,000 staff. We operate both group training, as in the labour hire of apprentices. We have private colleges in Australia, both in Sydney and Victoria, and we also are the single largest provider for the Australian government service, which is what's branded the Australian Apprenticeship Centre. So a significant footprint in Australia. I suppose a disclaimer here is you might not pick up everything that I take. You're not going to take everything away from my presentation, but certainly if I've given you one new idea that you can potentially implement back into your own country or into some sort of vocational program, well, my job's done. So thanks for having me here, and I appreciate you attending this session. I've titled the presentation today, as you'll see, Survival, Recovery, Growth. And I think we'd all appreciate that having gone through the recession, each country's suffered certain elements of recessional challenges. And I suppose what we're looking for is looking forward about how do we survive, how do we recover, and how do we look at potential growth moving forward. So hence the title of Survival, Recovery, Growth, and where do the apprenticeships and particularly the group training model fit in. The objectives of what I want to present to you today is quite clear. I want to just touch on the history of group training and the actual model, employer engagement. I think it's important that group training does play a significant role in the Australian market about taking out a lot of the bureaucracy and the policy away from industry and from particularly from a small business perspective. I want to touch on our approach to the UK market. Sustainability for all parties, both employers that are attached to us and also probably one of the most important parts of our business, which is essentially our apprentices, and skilling the apprentice learner, and essentially just some practical applied solutions that we've found. If I go back in time, back into the 80s, where group training was originally sort of evolved from, it was essentially established by, well, the two major players were the Master Builders Association and also a foundation through the automotive sector, where there was a consortium of individuals that came together and sat around. Australia was going through a period of time where skilling the workforce was quite challenging, and they saw that there was opportunity to come up with an innovative new model. So it was really owned at that stage by industry leaders, and Lend-Lease was obviously one of those particular organisations as well. The model in its own right was certainly it was designed for small to medium enterprises. So what I mean by that, effectively as a group training company, the association employed these apprentices, taking out all the bureaucracy and in turn supporting those small to medium enterprises. It's also quite a structured support safety net for all the parties involved. So being at both the apprentice learner and the host employer. Now I've got to say, we're going to get a bit of interaction happening shortly, and I've got some mystery guests in the audience, some quite distinguished guests that have had some significant experience within the group training market in the Australian landscape. So I'm going to call upon them shortly and introduce you to them. Some of the innovative approaches we've seen with group training in the Australian context, and I've touched on it there, is that there's certainly been some housing projects. And what I mean by housing projects, if I touch on one that MEGT's got running at the moment, is we're looking at affordable housing projects. So MEGT in its own right has purchased property whereby we're actually employing the apprentices to work on those construction sites, A, for two reasons. Obviously to give those individuals an employment outcome, and secondly developing it from a commercial perspective as well. In Australian terms, within the group training network there, we've got what's called AFL Sports Ready. And by just simply touching on it by way of example, did the particular group training company AFL Sports Ready focus on sport apprentices and trainees. So very significant play with a lot of the AFL football teams. So for those that don't know, Geelong won the premiership, which in effect is actually my hometown as well. So for the Australians, they'll appreciate that. I think. Well, they under group training arrangements. The other thing that we had, go the Cats. The other thing we have seen is, and I was personally involved in a project which was called Surf and Sport, and we were looking at seasonal labour requirements. Now, for particular employers that couldn't take particular individuals on for long extended period of times because they had short hits of labour. Now, what I mean by short hits of labour, if you go to any coastal places along particularly the Victorian coastline and some parts of New South Wales, you tend to find you get a population of 750 million move down there in the summer periods, and all of a sudden it drops as soon as winter comes. So we came up with some innovation about working with some organisations whereby we could not only have apprentices spend a six-month post seasonally on the coastline, but then in turn they'd go to the sporting arenas on the off-season once the coast had died off. The benefits to that is that the apprentice themselves had the ability to get the skills of both facilities, which only enhance the actual quality of the learning outcome for the apprentice, but from a labour perspective, fill that requirement for that organisation. So the model itself in a group training content obviously lends to that. I've got a little bit of an experience, and I'm just going to let you have a listen to this footage of Tom.
I'm from Sydney, Kirrawee, which is in Sydney. Doing two trades, my electrical trade and my instrumentation trade. I chose that career because it's very technically involved. It's also very hands-on, so you can get in there and you can do your work, hands, and there's a lot of thinking involved, and I like that. My group training employer is MEGT. I'm looked after by Rhonda Moore. So I can talk about all safety risks involved with the job, and so she can make sure that you are being treated well where you're working and you're learning what you need and you're working safely. The good thing about being employed through the group training organisations, they keep track of you. So you're working with your employer, but you've got somebody who sets time aside to come talk to you, see how you're going, and you can discuss a lot of OH&S risks with them, go over them. They make sure that you're working safely and you're fulfilling everything you need for your trade. An advantage with group training, I think, is there's the opportunity to get a large amount of experience because they move you around, and so you can kind of learn little bits from little various different places. They also keep track of you, so they make sure that you are actually progressing through your trade satisfactorily and not failing your test.
Yeah, I thought it was an interesting piece of footage, and I think we can all sort of get overly excited about commercially building a business, but when you see individually young learners and apprentices progress through their apprenticeship program and that are proud to sort of say that their experience has been a good experience, then I think that's something that we need to obviously promote. And as Tom draws upon is the fact that he's had the ability to see more than one workplace throughout his actual apprenticeship, and in some respects it's only going to increase his skill base long term. So I just thought I'd share that little bit of footage with you. I suppose we've been through quite an extensive review in Australia, and I'm not going to bore you with all the the politics of it, but we've been through quite an extensive review of what group training looks like for the future in the Australian context. It's quite a mature model that's been around since the 80s, but obviously looking at continued innovation attached both to support that particular group training companies is something that we can't set aside. I think we've also seen some different trends within the market as far as the procurement of labour and how employers have traditionally employed and how they're actually employing and how they will employ within the future. And there's a sense, I suppose, of customer needs and expectations of what the actual service does. Market share, competition, and we've got increased pressure from government through government service providers and different provisions that government offers through the likes of some of the Australian Apprenticeship Centre networks. So I think the future is bright for group training. It certainly, as I said, had its bedding down in Australia for an extended period of time, but it's now time to sort of look forward in an innovative way and what that looks like. And I'll ask someone to chat to me about that in a minute to you all. I want to touch a little bit about, I suppose, why the UK market and what we're actually essentially setting up here. Some time ago, my CEO had been coming in and out of the United Kingdom market to have a look at what the landscape looked like, and then there was a sense to say, let's look at bringing the particular model to the UK. It's a model that has been trialled in the 208 and a little bit in 209. And we've sort of sat and sort of looked at how that model's unfolded. As you'll see, I represent essentially two companies, both MEGT UK and Impact Apprenticeships, which you'll see some of the branding here. Impact Apprenticeships is essentially we've brought our concept and model into the United Kingdom. Impact Apprenticeships is a jointly owned venture via MEGT and also Loughborough College. The main reason we've done that is well, probably for one significant reason, is that MEGT, we don't have a brand here. We'd be naive to think that we'd probably come into the market without having local partners. And it's probably the other point that I make in that second dot point is that we're working with a series of different partners within the United Kingdom that have taken great interest in the actual model and concept that we will look at rolling it out with several other organisations. The marketplace challenges are probably not unlike the Australian marketplace, where we've seen we've done a series of education, different sessions with organisations, with associations, and also chambers. So it's very much about coming back to the basics of explaining how the actual model and the system works. There has been some concerns about the model in its sense as far as how it's supporting the learners, is their long-term employment outcomes. And I'll touch on some of those in a little bit. Employer engagement, it's interesting. We've touched both the corporate sector employers and also the SME market. And I want to touch on some of the opportunities in a moment, but a lot of employers that we have engaged with have been quite excited about the model and could see where the model can fit in a series of different ways, which probably leads me on to the opportunities. I was going to start from the top down, but I actually want to go from the reverse up. There's a lot around the corporate responsibility, and what I mean by corporate responsibility, we're seeing that the SME market's been suffering as far as labour requirements, and we've had some great interest from organisations that are prepared to take on board from a corporate responsibility perspective to look at how they can deliver foundation skills, foundation employment, and then we'll actually look at transitioning those individual learners out into the SME market. Why is that important? When we talk to an SME employer, they say they haven't got time to actually, sort of get the young fella, get a haircut, get him cleaned up and sorted. So we've had some interest from there. I think the other thing also is the community-based activities with local authorities. And if we look back in time when group trainings first started in Australia, the regional and community areas were fairly strong, and it was a significant part of the growth with local authorities. And it goes without saying the support from the SME market and in turn to support those regional youth. I suppose the final points that I want to make before we open up the floor and I invite some guests to perhaps comment is the model has demonstrated it's been a long supported service within the Australian market, and it wouldn't have survived unless it had had some value add to the marketplace. I think the management of the actual apprentices and the learner's career is essentially, it's a considerable part of what we do on a daily basis. I think there's support back to our host employers and taking, as I said, that bureaucracy out, because as we'd all appreciate, they're busy working their own business. They're not interested in essentially getting tied up with all of that. The other element that I will highlight is that the model has supported and maintained, the best of nearly 50,000 apprentices on an annual basis at any given time. And also completion rates is a big element. If you look at the recruitment and the way that we actually support learners, it does reflect in some of those figures as well. So I want to say thank you. I hope you've collected something from that. And perhaps if I call Jim, I've got Jim Barron, who's the CEO of Group Train Australia, so I'm very privileged to have him sitting here. I also have my own CEO sitting in the back of the blocks, David Windridge, who I'll ask for some comments shortly, and also Robin Shreve, who's Head of Skills Australia. So, Jim, I don't know if you want to make a few comments on the model and what I suppose the benefits that you've seen it evolve, Jim.
Sure. Thanks, Ashley. I guess all I'd say is that the model of group training, to me, is probably more relevant to the marketplace than it ever has been. It's a one-stop shop, holistic model. It accepts that, the old style one-on-one relationship that employers have to apprentices in many old industries that are changing is just not possible to sort of repeat that. And often you do need a more holistic model that recognises that in many respects to start or to engage in interest and then start, progress and complete an apprenticeship, it takes, as Hillary Clinton would say, it takes a village. And group training is in many respects a employment and training village. It has enormous tentacles into most school networks in Australia. It has an ability to read local labour market trends. It has an army of what we call field officers who are able to basically case manage individual apprentices. It has the capacity through that to not only operate 9 to 5 but also 5 to 9. A lot of apprentices, as we know, are not traditionally 15 or 16. They don't live at home. They don't have support networks. Group training can provide those support networks. But importantly, most importantly, I think in this day and age, it is a demand-driven system. It works at the behest, basically, of local labour markets. It provides opportunities to employers, small, medium, gargantuan, to basically grow their workforce organically from the bottom up. Of course, that's what organically means, of course. So those features are very important, I think, in Australia. As Ashley rightly said, we've gone through a bit of an internal navel-gazing exercise. We've now come out the other end. But it does have features, the ones I've talked about, that are absolutely universal to every marketplace in the world that's looking to sort of grow and reboot their apprenticeship system. So it's great that MEGT, through Ashley and David, are here in the UK. We've visited with a group of distinguished Australians and Europeans and lovely people from the UK, most of which are here actually, to Jamaica early in the year. So we really want to export this model. So help us export it.
Thanks, Jim. Appreciate your words. I might perhaps grab David. If David Windridge is our CEO, and by way of history, David was, I suppose, I consider him as a founding member of MEGT, because at the stage when he took it on, it was actually quite a small group training company, and I think there's a misunderstanding about how group training can accelerate growth as far as apprentice numbers. You can't discount the quality that the service offers, but you can't discount the quality amongst growth. So it's about managing the two from a commercial perspective. And as Jim rightfully said, the group training companies in the Australian marketplace, to get to the significant numbers that it actually maintains on an annual basis, has taken years. So if you look at some of those organisations, David started in the network basically in the early 90s, so he's seen the actual evolution, how it's evolved and how it's been fertilised to get it to the stage of where both our organisation and the whole Group Training Association network is today. So David, you might want to talk about, you know, some of that growth from the nursery to where it is today. Thanks, Dave.
Thanks, Ashley, and thanks to everybody for being here. I guess the only things I would comment on briefly, and I'll kind of ramble on for a little bit, but each group train, and there are 150 group training companies across Australia. Each is unique, it's separately incorporated and operates in its own structure. So there isn't a universal model which is applied from the top down or anything like that. Each has been allowed to evolve in its own local market to meet the local needs and the local opportunities. Some have failed, and so that there have been issues of failure, but that happens in a free market. But equally, there have been many that have blossomed and that have been very successful. As I said, each group training company is separate. We are a not-for-profit company, so we exist in Australia to serve the local community. I'm very fortunate in that we never defined what the local community was for MEGT, so every time I open up a new office we simply say that's part of the local community. So it's been fairly easy to justify the expansion, so I've been particularly blessed with that. But of course I got to write the constitution of the organisation, so I made sure that it had a lot of flexibility in it to do the things which I thought were necessary and possible. In terms of the growth over the last 20 years, it's been solid. Group training companies grew particularly in the 90s in Australia, and it was a very strong period of growth. Subsequent to that, the Australian government has developed some new ways of supporting apprenticeships, which has meant that there hasn't been the same demand for growth for group training companies, but equally there hasn't been a reduction in demand. So you know, some people say that we've plateaued, and I think perhaps in using the old methodologies and the old selling structures and the old services that we deliver, we have plateaued as a group of companies. However, from my perspective, what that represents is simply an opportunity for the company to get involved in new ways of doing business, new ways of supporting apprenticeships and find those new services. And so that's what we've set out very much to do. So we've tried to innovate the model and tried to change it. So just because it worked in 1995 or 2005 doesn't mean that it's the right model for 2011 nor 2015. So it is something that is evolving, and we, because we treat it as a business, have been in the fortunate position where we've been able to do that. We haven't been locked into something which is simply, this is the way we do it and this is always the way we will do it. We've been able to do things quite differently. We've got a strong commercial focus as the company, but we've got a strong community focus. We run areas such as we've got an Indigenous group of group training apprentices, and in Australia the Indigenous or Aboriginal communities are particularly disadvantaged and particularly hard to deal with in terms of addressing the particular circumstances and needs of that community. MEGT is in the fortunate position, it's been financially strong from its other business opportunities, has been able to invest back into Indigenous services and provide that support. As Ashley said before, another thing that we've done, which is reasonably commercial, is that we actually purchased a number of blocks of land, nowhere near as many as I wanted, but the board were a little bit more cautious than me. They said, let's enter into this in a small way. We've purchased a number of blocks of land and engaged some building firms to actually build affordable housing on those blocks of land, utilising the services of our apprentices and trainees. And the legal people that have been advising in that, we sold our trainees into their legal firm. The real estate people that are helping us sell those houses, They are taking our trainees. So we've created the demand for apprentices and trainees, not only just in the construction of that, but in all the other services that sit around that. Even the accounting firm that originally advised us on the project has taken our trainees as part of the offset. So we have utilised that to try and generate that demand. Some of those housing will be sold at commercial rates as affordable housing, so it's not dear housing, but it's affordable housing. Some of it will be sold as at a commercial rate, but some of the houses are going to be put aside and going to be sold to our own apprentices and trainees at a discounted rate. Now, the interesting thing is that, of course, under Australian government law, that's seen as providing a benefit to your employees, and so all of a sudden it attracts fringe benefits tax, which, you know, sometimes you do these things and you set out on a path and you don't anticipate that there'll actually be other problems, and fringe benefits tax actually surfaced late in our deliberations on this as a potential problem. But anyway, we'll simply address that and we'll get on with it, because it's more important that we actually finish the project and we satisfy those needs. That's just a couple of things that we do. We're doing many other things, and Ashley is over here in Australia working with Loughborough College, employed by MEGT UK, and I think he's doing a great job, and I very much appreciate all the support that a number of people in this audience have given to him. Thanks.
Thanks, David. Thanks, David. I'm not sure, as I said, I've been privileged also to have, I'm not sure if I want to drag Robin up here or not. I mean, Robin is head of Skills Australia, which is a significant body that's been set up by the Australian government to look at skills and skills demand. Robin's obviously seen group training and where it's positioned in the moment. I'm not sure whether, Robin, you want to sort of mention a few things about your sort of experience with both the group training system, and because you've had experience obviously but in both camps, Robin, both from a UK perspective and also an Australian marketplace perspective. Yeah, that'd be good. Just
it's a bit like a wedding, isn't it? You get to invite all the guests to say something. We're, as our Minister says, we're very fortunate in Australia. In some parts of our economy, our biggest problem is skill shortages. We've got a resources boom going on at the moment, which has pushed the Australian dollar up to 100% increase in value compared to the US dollar in the last 3 years, which has actually driven down. It gives us problems in tourism and manufacture, which you know, is another issue that we're dealing with. So we've got a patchwork economy. But Skills Australia estimates that we'll need, in a country of 22 million people, 11.2 million in the workforce. By 2015, we feel we'll need an extra 2.4 million people with qualifications at Certificate 3 and above. Now, that's not 2.4 million new jobs. It's actually 800,000 new jobs. It's 800,000 replacements for people who are retiring, but it also means it's 800,000 people who haven't currently got a Certificate 3, who need one. And if we don't do that, we will have further skill shortages, which will result in wage inflation, which will result in general inflation, which will result in higher interest rates. And our interest rates are touching 5% at the moment, which is a lot compared to Europe, and that could depress. So we are actually looking, and certainly recently the mining industry, for example, through a group training company, has taken on 1,000 potential mature workers who will get recognition of prior learning and recognition of current competencies for 18 months of their 3-year apprenticeship. But the group training organisation involved is a critical component of actually delivering those extra 1,000 workers to the mining industry. So there's group training is involved in that. Yeah. It's interesting that I swore allegiance to the Queen of Australia in 1983, but I have worked on and off in the UK both before and after then, and you know, there are cultural differences in terms of language. Curriculum means something slightly different in Australia than it does in the UK, which is quite interesting. And I was involved with establishing an early group training scheme in London. We started off prior to the GFC, and we sort of launched during the GFC, but I'm happy to say it's still going. And I mean, I think one of the things is, if you take the London market, I think one of the issues that group training schemes have to face is, certainly in London at the time, everybody warned us, but we were London-based, so we did it, was the amount of churn. If you have lots of churn, it gives you a bit of an issue. But, I mean, I think the model's got... I mean, for people who don't know it, if you just think of it, I think the best description, Jim might not disagree, that's a double negative there, Jim. The best description of group training I heard was done by a lady called Kay Schofield, who actually said it's a noble intent labour hire company.
Totally disagree.
No. But in terms of like that, so you've got the labour hire component and you've also got the training component. Absolutely, but the point is, the advantage is the apprentice is employed by a labour hire company who is committed to giving training and making sure that the apprentice can iron out both the ups and the downs of the system, and that's the basic thought and the basic model. And for small businesses, if you're, originally in the bush, you're a carpenter, you've got your ute with a dog in the back called Blue, and you're not sure how much work you're going to do in a year's hence. If you can have a group training company like MEGT, means that you can take on the apprentice and you haven't got to worry that in a year's time, if the work dries up, you're going to make the apprentice redundant. The apprentice has got continuity of both employment with another employer and continuity of training. And I think that's the really big advantage, and I think that must be, in some ways, a transportable model.
Thanks, Robin. And as I mentioned, we are very privileged to have these three individuals, and I thank both David, Robin, and also Jim for adding their pieces, because they've certainly had an extensive level of experience, not only with the Australian system, the group training system, but also the vocational education system. I'm happy enough to open it up for questions. I don't know if I've stimulated and whet your appetite on this Friday afternoon. You're probably all sitting there thinking, I want to go to the Sherlock Holmes and have a pint and relax, because I know that we wind up at 3, but I'm happy enough to open up for questions. One thing that I will say, we are early players as in impact apprenticeships. We are early, we've been in the market for only a short period of time. And we've spent a lot of time, I suppose, looking at how the model will evolve. And I must admit, there are common synergies between Australia and the UK, but there are elements that are miles apart between the two. So to try and bring a system in here, we couldn't assume that we would just pick it up and drop it into this country. There's been a lot of design and moulding. The other thing I will say, we've been very fortunate to spend some time with the UK Commission for Employment and Skills, and we've been able to iron out some challenges around the apprenticeship, what's been branded the Apprenticeship Training Agency, which is what essentially Impact Apprenticeships is here in the UK, around what's the long-term outcomes for individual apprentice learners. It's a challenge we've faced in Australia about when they complete their apprenticeship, what happens? Do they get put on the scrap heap? Do they get ongoing employment? One of the things we've come up in design is an outplacement element of service. So once the apprentice actually completes, what do we do with that individual? We don't want to sort of let them drop off and end up into the unemployment market, because I can assure you we will be looked at and scrutinised if we seem to be churning people into the system and out of the system. So we've looked at it, and it could be articulation pathways. So what I mean by articulation pathways, up into a higher apprenticeship program, into a level 3. We've also got higher apprenticeship programs which we're starting to see evolve here in the UK, and essentially we've had some extensive discussions with a lot of universities around what we can do. I mean, by way of example, for the automotive sector, once we have apprentices complete, we've had discussions with particular universities about bringing them up into partial tertiary studies and HE. So I'm happy enough to take questions. I hope that's given you a bit of an insight into our activity both in the Australian landscape and also here with what we're doing in the UK. I did cover a fair bit in the dot points, and I suppose there's only so much I can go into without standing and going into a whole variety of details. But happy enough to take questions. As I said, I know you're all... Look out, I've got one from Mark.
Has group training been implemented so far? In which countries?
Hang on, I'm going to give...
in which countries has group training been implemented so far?
That's probably a good question for Jim Barron.
Well, I guess it's been implemented here to a certain extent. We've had dealings with Canada, and their attempt, one organisation in British Columbia is seriously interested in dropping it into their system. We continue, it's been implemented in New Zealand. There's 3 industry-based group training organisations in New Zealand. It's been, South Africa has, for about the last decade, I think, David, has been adopting a form of group training and continues to investigate it. Even countries like Germany, who you wouldn't have thought needs to sort of study any other model, has indicated lots of interest over the years. So there are various countries who are maintaining a strong interest.
Thanks, Jim. Thanks for the question. Do I have any other questions? Yeah. I had the age group. Interesting question. Did we do some statistics on that, Jim, with age demographic? I mean, generally you would tend to find it's your 16 to 19-year-olds. I'm just thinking, although having said that, I've personally been involved in some mature age programs as well, but perhaps, I don't know if you've got some figures on that, Jim?
Well, I think the group training figures pretty much reflect the national figures, and I think now over 33 or 4%, I think Robin would know, of first-year apprentices in Australia are over the age of 21, which is a radical shift from even 20 years ago when the average first year was 15 or 16. So the ageing of the workforce and the ageing of the apprenticeship workforce has all sorts of implications, particularly wages. You know, taking on a first-year apprentice who was 15 or 16 is a very different challenge for an employer taking on over 21 who has to be paid adult wages under the Australian Fair Work system. So, but I think the average is still, you know, it's getting up towards 21 first year.
The Australian vet sector is actually, a majority of its students are actually aged over 24. I mean, it's one of the things we do quite well is lifelong learning. So we've got all the way through. I mean, one of the cultural differences in Australia is that compared to the UK where people go through to year 13, it's in Australia people leave school at the end of year 12, and most states have now abolished the year 10 leaving certificate. It used to be years ago you stayed on to school to get year 10 and you got something called the General Certificate of Education, which was roughly equivalent to GCSEs. Most states have abolished that now. So there's no, when people in the UK talk about 5 GCSEs A to C, we really haven't got an equivalent in terms of an external credential. People take tests because the assumption is that people will still, majority will stay on to the end of year 12, and you're getting a growing number of apprentices who are post year 12, where historically they used to be post year 10. Now that's not to say that some kids leave school at year 10, and group training, because of all the mentoring support, does a great job in terms of getting those people through. But adult apprenticeships are pretty big, and adult traineeships are pretty big as well.
Thanks. Interesting question. I mean, in relation to, in the United Kingdom, we've got what's called NEETs, which are not in employment, education and training, which are our cohort of 16 to 18-year-olds. And when I come back to the model that I touched on about social responsibility and the fact that we actually try to have corporate organisations support the SME market, and the NEETs part of that for the 16 to 18-year-old cohorts is very much about how this project will work. Because if, now I'm just trying to think of the figures, Robin, Professor Alison Wolfe did a review of the vet sector here in the United Kingdom, and that report reflected there was an increase in 19 plus starts, an increase in level 2 starts and a decline in level 3, as in the level 3 apprenticeship framework. And I can't remember what increase it was, Robin, in the 19 plus, but it was about 7%, I think, on... I'm just trying to think of the actual percentage.
The direct comparison to the Wolf report in Australia would actually be vet in school.
Yeah, correct.
That would be the direct, and you know, it's a different structure in Australia, because you don't have huge numbers of people leaving school at 16 and doing full-time vocational courses.
Correct.
they're either doing an apprenticeship or they're staying at school, and they might do some modules at school as part of their high school certificate.
Yeah, and I think pre-employment and pre-vocational is a big element of supporting particularly the NEETs here in the UK. I know that within the Australian landscape, and having played with it for some time myself personally, that having pre-vocational, I mean, we, you know, and Jim might comment that we personally use that as a recruiting pool. So we ear tag those young individual apprentices and learners that are going through pre-vocational, whether it's a 16-week qualification course, because they're almost the best of the best. From a recruitment perspective, you know that they want to be in there. But to actually look at that cohort of NEETs that are not in employment, education and training, 16 to 18-year-olds, to be able to turn around and develop some pre-vocational activity that's focused on a specific industry sector that they want to be participating in, should hopefully in time maybe create extra additional job outcomes and get some of those youngsters into employment. Have I got any other questions at all? No, you're all sort of sitting here waiting for a pint, I gather.
I was just wondering what reaction you're getting from the existing training providers and sector skills councils in the UK, who are very wedded to the traditional apprentice framework and look with suspicion on this type of group training agreement. I think I'm working in the construction sector and I can see a lot of benefits from it, particularly on the social side. But I know you'll be up against a lot of opposition to get this rolling in a big way.
Yeah, thanks. I mean, the construction sector is an interesting one because of the levy that's actually, that's a challenge in itself without getting contact. Can I just make the comment that the Sector Skills Council, we've had some extensive discussions with the IMI Sector Skills Council that see this model as absolute underpinning to support the growth. The IMI Sector Skills Council, being the automotive one, are looking at a 5% increase in apprentice starts. The automotive sector's had a decline over the last 4 years as far as apprentices that are actually being employed within the sector, yet the sector itself still reflects that it's buoyant. And if you've noticed that the UK government have significantly invested into the automotive sector here within the UK, the response we've had is we've had their board tick off on a particular project which we will go live with them towards the end of this year. So in light of your question, they have responded to that. They've seen the opportunity. If I go back to sort of my second or third slide, when we look at the model back in the 80s, it was about collectively coming together, bringing the appropriate stakeholders to the table whereby each of us adds some value to a sector and to the actual business model. So, yeah, it's been accepted quite well, if that answers your question. Yeah. I mean, we've got a lot of work to do, but we are getting there, so. Have I got any other questions? Any? No, you're all. Well, I think I've done the best in time. So, I need to get an apology. I need to get a, you know, like an applause for that. I think, for, you know. Thanks for your time, and once again, I just want to thank David, Robin, and Jim for their input today as well.
Well, I'm just here to thank you on behalf of WorldSkills International. We have a replica of one of the medals that the kids are going to get, so I think you deserve a medal. Yeah, thank you. That's a small memento, and thanks for your participation today. Thank you all for being here, and we'll see you out on the floor. Thanks.